Thanks very much. Thanks for attending. It's very exciting. There are quite a few people attending from a number of different countries, from Africa and from Europe mostly, but I don't have the full list. So I wanted to start by just disclosing financial interest to let you know that I have no pharmaceutical industry funding. Health Action International as an organization also does not accept pharmaceutical industry funding. And I have acted as an expert witness in one legal case against a pharmaceutical company involving an application for a class action suit on cardiovascular risks of a testosterone product. So I wanted to start by saying as well that this presentation is mainly focusing on commercial influences on medical and pharmacy education, but we're really, I think the information should be of interest more broadly, and you know, you're certainly welcome to send comments and to ask questions, whether or not you happen to be a student. Often people will accept free samples, for instance, thinking that they're just helping out their patients, even though those are also a way to seed the market. And also the view that, well, if I don't take any notice, it won't affect me. And like everyone, I have that feeling as well, that I'm not influenced by advertising and promotion. I think all of us know that the companies involved would not be spending all of this money if it wasn't effective in some way. So this is a survey by a survey of internal medical medicine residents, in which they were asked, how much influence do sales representatives have on your prescribing? You'll see very reassuring. Hardly anybody thought that it was a lot of influence. Most people thought that they were not being influenced at all. Now, if you ask the same question about their colleagues prescribing, you'll see that the picture is quite different. So again, I think it's sort of the side that whether doctors, pharmacists, academics, a lot of people will feel that they're not influenced, but in fact, there certainly is an influence. Now, one of the things that's important about drug promotion is it focuses the attention generally on newer on-patent drugs. And I just have Steve Jobs showing the new MacBook Air when it came out versus an Underwood typewriter, because most people, except maybe a few hipsters, would prefer the newer computer, or believe that because something is newer, that it's going to be better in terms of actually being, if it's a medicine, being a better treatment option. When it comes to medicines, that isn't the case in the same way as many other technologies. And that's because for a company to bring a new medicine to market, generally what they have to show is that it's effective as compared to placebo, or if it's for a very serious disease, for instance, it's an HIV/AIDS treatment, or it might be an antibiotic for a serious infection, they need to show that it's non-inferior as compared to existing treatments. And so you'll see this is an overview of 15 years worth of evaluations of every new medicine and every new approved use for a medicine in France by a drug bulletin called La Revue Prescrire that is run by physicians and pharmacists in France. And that is independent of actually both government and the pharmaceutical industry. They're funded by subscription. They have a 7-point rating scale, and as you'll see, really it's only around 7% of the drugs that have been shown very clearly to show an advantage compared to existing medicines, and around 15% that they judged to be not acceptable, generally because they had a worse safety profile or less effective than drugs that are already on the market. a large majority of new drugs are what are called Me Too's, in the sense that they're quite similar to other drugs in the same class and really are neither more nor less effective. Now, when a drug first comes to market as well, we usually don't know very much about the effects in vulnerable groups. Longer term effects or less frequent harm, or how the drug compares with existing treatment options. And that's because generally medicines are tested before they come to market, on average in around 2,000 to 3,000 people, and generally in very restricted populations as well. And what that means is there's a need for more caution when a drug first comes to market. So it's quite different in that sense from the aims of a company, which is to recoup the investment that they have made in pre-market research and to stimulate sales. So every new drug that does come to market must obtain market sales. This is an example of the kinds of images in advertising that really draw you in and provide a very sort of simple very simple statement that promises very strong effectiveness. Now, this is a drug that was rated non-acceptable by Prescrire. They have a little person image for each of the ratings. And the reason is that it's similar in effectiveness to other antidepressants, but actually has greater liver toxicity. This chart is from another analysis by Dr. Joel Lechtjen, looking at which drugs were being most heavily promoted in Canada in the years 2013 to 2015. And then he looked at how they had been rated by Prescrire in terms of whether or not they provided a therapeutic advantage over existing treatments. And as you'll see, the large majority, over 90% in each year, actually have no evidence of therapeutic gain as compared to existing alternatives. What this points out is an inherent conflict of interest between the legitimate business goals of manufacturers and the social, medical, and economic needs of providers and users and the public to select and use drugs in the most rational way. So really that there's a different, that companies have a different incentive in terms of promoting the use of medicines than health professionals would have in terms of choosing treatments for patients. That's important in terms of thinking of commercial influences on professional education, both in terms of medical or pharmacy studies to gain a professional degree, and then also in terms of continuing professional education. A systematic review was carried out of all of the studies looking at medical students' exposures and attitudes to pharmaceutical marketing. And this combined the data from 32 studies in 14 countries. Some of the main findings was that everywhere there is quite frequent exposure to pharmaceutical marketing, that students tend to have more contact with pharmaceutical industry and sales representatives during their clinical years than preclinical years, and that where there were more restrictive institutional policies in terms of restricting contact, students also tended to be more skeptical about promotion. And another finding was that in the majority of cases, the students felt that they didn't get adequate education about promotional interactions and how to manage the situations that will come up in their professional practice in terms of interaction with industry. This slide provides an overview of research that we carried out recently in Australia. In Australia, industry transparency reports about their funding of health professionals focused on educational events for health professionals between 2007 and 2015. And we analyzed the last 4 years of those educational events. What we found was that they were ubiquitous, that over that 4-year period, there were over 116,000 events that were being reported on in a country with quite a small population, 25 million people, and that this amounted to about 600, over 600 per week, that trainees, so medical students and interns mainly, attended nearly 40% of those events, and they were attending them actually more often than primary care doctors. A lot of those events were in hospitals, things like journal clubs, hospital rounds. They were also nice dinners at restaurants, funding for conferences. One of the things that happened more often than anything else at those events was food and drink being provided. So food and drink that are provided are actually a gift. This is an example of one of the dinner events. So this was an invitation where the image that's used here is actually the same image as had appeared in a Medical Journal of Australia ad for quetiapine or Seroquel in the year before. So it's fairly easy to figure out what is this presentation about. Now, actually this red, sorry, the red circle is a bit too low. It should be around Dr. Ian Katz. It's an example of what often happens at these educational events, which is that a clinical or academic expert is asked to speak. Now that person will be asked to speak only if their message is consistent with the message that the company wants to promote. And often they're provided with slides and so a slide set for their presentation. So one of the other main ways in which there is a lot of influence, commercial influence on medical and pharmacy education is through funding of academic clinicians as key opinion leaders. This is just an overview of the most common types of funding that both clinical experts and academic clinical experts will get. I've colored 3 of these circles in pink because these are especially important in terms of being the type of funding that key opinion leaders will receive. So clinicians will be, essentially they'll be paid by a company in order to provide talks to other clinicians and also to be members of advisory boards or to obtain consulting fees. We've seen a lot less of the sort of funding for clinicians to obtain outrageous gifts like a new computer or a nice new car or all kinds of things that had occurred in the past. But in fact, the kind of funding that's received for these types of consultancies can end up being in the hundreds of thousands, the tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars per year. So it can be seen as well as a type of gift that occurs that can then really influence what are the messages that other clinicians are hearing. I wanted to show you this as well. This is an example of what is called disease-oriented promotion, and it's actually not by a pharmaceutical company, but it's by an Australian non-profit organization that receives funding from pharmaceutical companies. Very simple message as well, that an older person might want to go on to antidepressants and they can be happy and healthy during their retirement. At least that would be how I would understand that message. It's all kinds of, I could say all kinds of things about it, but it's another, the funding of patient groups by industry is another indirect way that in fact there's influence on professionals. So again, to come back to the general point, with one of the reasons that these commercial influences are so effective is really the view that's quite widespread, which is that they really don't matter and aren't affecting clinical care. So very common kind of opinion, I can't be bought for the price of a pizza. A study in the US that used hundreds of thousands of funding events, combined hundreds of thousands of funding events with prescribing data, actually looked at the relationship between receiving even one very cheap meal worth less than $20 US and subsequent prescribing decisions in 4 treatment areas. Now, they were able to carry out this study because of data that's now publicly available through the US Sunshine Act, where companies report on every payment that they're making to physicians. And you'll see that there's a dose response. The more meals that a doctor received, the more likely they were to prescribe promoted drug. So that's kind of to give you a bit of a taster in terms of the evidence on the influence of promotion on professional practice. What about on the research evidence itself? So I was involved in actually an update. So this is the latest version of a Cochrane systematic review looking at the relationship between industry sponsorship of a study and the outcome of that study. And so we were looking at whether the outcomes of studies were more likely to be favorable for a specific tested product if they were sponsored by a company that was that had produced the product or was marketing the product. And what we found was that there is a relationship, the relative risk of a favorable result or favorable conclusions are about 30% higher if the study has been sponsored by a commercial company. One of the interesting things about this is it didn't reflect necessarily poor methods in those industry-sponsored studies in terms of some of the methodological issues that have been shown to lead to more favorable results. So industry studies were more likely to be blinded, for instance, than non-industry funded studies. But regardless, they tended to have a more favorable result for the product. This is giving a bit of a hint of why. So this is an example comparing atypical antipsychotics. So why olanzapine beats risperidone, risperidone beats quetiapine, quetiapine beats olanzapine. So it's actually a circle as like a snake that is eating its own tail. This is not really possible, that if it was only based on each of the drugs being better than the drug that it was tested against. In fact, the reason this is looking at which drug did better related to which company happened to sponsor the study. And so there's a number of reasons that can occur. And my colleague Lisa Barrow talks about a circle of bias in terms of the ways that commercial influences can affect research results. First one is what question is asked, whether the question is very restricted and say the outcomes that are being looked at are related to the known mechanism of action of the drug. So you have antidepressant trials, for instance, looking at outcomes related to, so they're looking at effects on depression symptoms, much less on how well a person is able to sort of regain control over their lives, how well whether they're able to return to work, more fundamental issues that might have more to do with the reason that a person might have become depressed in the first place. The population that's studied can also affect the outcome. And if I go back to antidepressants again, we know from previous trials that they're more likely to show statistically significant effects versus placebo if they're tested in more severely depressed populations, even though when you actually then look at clinical use, most of the use is with milder depression. So you can get a link of who it's being tested on to try to give the product a best shot of doing better. The actual methods that are used in the trial itself can also affect results, as can the conduct of the trial, and then also publication. And that is in two different ways. One is whether you have selective publication of more positive trials that have more positive results, with the trials with negative results staying unpublished, and then also whether within a specific study, the results in which the drugs seem to do better are given prominence, even if these weren't say the primary outcome measure that was identified ahead of time. Now, this is an example of a clinical trial report for a fairly newly approved antidepressant. I started out with antidepressants as an example, so I'll continue with them. I could have picked a whole range of different types of drugs, but it's an example of vortioxetine, brand name Brintellix. And here you're looking at a trial that was funded by the company, and now it's become more and more common for the role of the sponsor to need to be mentioned in the clinical trial report. So in this case, the sponsor was involved in design, investigator selection, conduct, collection of data, analysis, interpretation, and writing. So really not independent in any way. And then there's a reassuring statement at the end that the authors had full control over the content of the manuscript, but actually all of them were employees of the company. So it's another way of saying the company had full control over the manuscript. If you looked at all of the studies that were, all of the randomized controlled trials testing this drug versus placebo, you'll find a very, very heavy manufacturer involvement in all of them. So you get then really the whole body of evidence being affected. This one is interesting because it actually compares vortioxetine to duloxetine, but the report doesn't report on, they don't report on any direct comparison. And that's because duloxetine was actually a little bit more effective than vortioxetine in terms of its effects on symptoms of depression. Now, my guess is if it had gone the other way, we would see that comparison front and center. So it's that kind of selective reporting that can affect also cause a bias in terms of the research evidence. So the other side is publication bias. And there have been a lot of improvements made recently in terms of trying to address incomplete and biased publication of clinical trials. So for example, clinical trial registries, requirements for every trial to be registered, and also now the European Medicines Agency has started to make public the full clinical study reports, which allows a much more complete overview of what the results of a study were. Despite this, publications are still incomplete, that we're still seeing a situation where many studies are not published in full, or studies will be registered, but the actual results will not be reported publicly. Now, this is an example of a systematic review that was really influential in terms of raising the concerns about incomplete clinical trial publication. It's a systematic review by Eric Turner and colleagues, published in 2008, in which they looked at all of the trials of antidepressants. So it was about 12 products that were submitted to the US FDA, including both the published and the unpublished ones. There were 74 studies. 38 of them were positive, and what positive means is that the drug was statistically significantly better than placebo. Now, that means that there were, 38 of them were positive, 37 of those were published. Another 36, so nearly half of them either had questionable results or negative. And what negative results would mean is that there was no difference versus placebo. Now, what's interesting about this is that of those 36, 22 were not published at all. And then another 11 were published with spin. So essentially published to look more positive than the FDA conclusion about the study results. What that created was an impression that antidepressants are more effective than they actually have been shown according to the clinical trial evidence, actually exaggerating their effectiveness by about a third. And this is an example, so this is an example here of, again, another study report of an antidepressant, but in this case, it's testing an antidepressant for off-label use, for use in adolescents. And I've just put a quote up above here of, whoops, sorry, I'll just move back. Major conclusions from the authors of this study, which is that it's generally paroxetine or also Paxil or Seroxat, the brand name, is generally well tolerated and effective for major depression in adolescents. Now, this actually this trial became notorious partly because it was very influential in terms of spreading the use of antidepressants to adolescents, and particularly paroxetine. It's known also as Study 329, and it was published in 2001. In 2015, a reanalysis of the study results was published. The researchers who carried out this reanalysis were able to get all of the original study data, and what they found was quite different than what generally effective and well tolerated. In fact, they found no significant differences in efficacy versus placebo. In other words, no advantage in terms of treatment of the symptoms of depression, and clinically significant increases in harm, including suicidality in adolescents. Now, this trial was part of a whole range of evidence that the US Department of Justice used in a legal case against GlaxoSmithKline, GSK. GSK pled guilty and actually at the time paid the largest settlement of any pharmaceutical fraud case in the US, $3 billion. The charges, so they involved paroxetine and also other products. The paroxetine charges included, in part, this misleading journal article that misreported the trial results. The fact that the company had kept other negative results secret, that they had sponsored so-called educational events, dinners, lunches to promote use of the product in children and adolescents, and that they had paid key opinion leader speakers to promote this use. Now, if you look back at this study report, it looks very dull. It doesn't look like an advertisement at all, but in fact, the information in it was as misleading as a lot of the information in it. So the other thing that comes, the other key point I wanted to make is it's not simply a case of GSK misreporting trial reports. This is an example of another trial that was testing another antidepressant, citalopram, for use in adolescents. Reanalysis, it's a critique looking at the original data again and again, finding that the published article was inconsistent with the protocol, and that also the authors that had been listed on the original article were not the people who had written the article. It was in fact what are called ghostwriters, so paid medical communication firm. So, okay, that sounds a little bit depressing, maybe. Yes, okay, it sounds a little bit depressing. What kind of solutions are there to undo commercial influence? I think there are a range of solutions. This happens to be a picture of the University of Maastricht. So one of the types of solutions are institutional solutions that medical faculties and other educational institutions can take. There are also individual solutions. There are also regulatory solutions that can occur. I'm mainly actually going to talk about individual solutions because I wanted to talk about unbiased treatment information as one solution. But I wanted to start with an example of a really important initiative to promote institutional change, and that as an initiative by the American Medical Students Association, what they called their scorecard. It used to be called the Farm-Free Scorecard, in which they sent a questionnaire to every medical faculty in the United States about their conflict of interest policies. And then they have a searchable website in which they give the universities an A to F rating, and they explain why in terms of what are their policies, for instance, on having gifts from pharmaceutical companies, free meals on their premises, their academic faculty being able to be paid speakers, etc. And I've just showed you a bit of the A page, but when they first started this survey in 2007, some of the major universities in the US, like Harvard, had D's or F's. And so what occurred is that it was a stimulus for those universities to strike up a conflict of interest committee and to actually put in conflict of interest policies. So it's made a huge difference to policy at medical faculties in the US. And this is just an example of a study that looked at graduates of medical faculties who had graduated after who had studied after there were more restrictive policies in place as compared to those who had studied before those restrictions were brought in. And what they found was that the students who had studied, so the doctors who had been students when there were more restrictive policies in place were less likely to prescribe new psychotropic drugs for which there wasn't any evidence of treatment advantage, but are more expensive, needless to say, and heavily promoted. So a number of other solutions at an institutional or regulatory basis, but what I wanted to turn to just as the last part of this presentation is individual solutions. So one of them is groups. This is an example of a group from Spain called No Gracias. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. There are many countries have groups that are what are called no free lunch groups of doctors who agree that they don't want to see sales representatives, and they will get their information on drugs from independent sources, and who are also involved in a number of different initiatives to promote independence from commercial influences. The other thing that's been very important as a trend is that in order to promote more independent assessments of the evidence is evidence-based medicine. So probably many of you have heard of the Cochrane collaboration, the whole move towards systematic review evidence that takes all of the evidence to answer a specific research question and then applies it to clinical care decisions. I call this evidence rather than eminence-based medicine because a lot of the use of key opinion leaders by industry is really taking, selling a product through involvement of people who are known to be experts rather than a complete overview of the evidence on the benefit and harms of medicines. And this is based, so a comprehensive view of the evidence is based on systematic reviews where they're based on asking a relevant and very answerable clinical question. then doing a very comprehensive literature search to find all the possible data, selecting studies that can meet the inclusion criteria, that can answer this question. And then this figure on the right-hand side is an example of a forest plot, a meta-analysis in which the ends of the lines are the confidence intervals around each of those individual study outcomes. They're then combined in a meta-analysis to get a much more precise answer to a research question. What's very important about this kind of comprehensive overview is that it also has to take into account the quality of the studies and the assessments of risk, an assessment of risks of bias. How strong were the methods? How well was the study carried out? Can you trust the results? Did they compare using unequal dose comparison, for instance, in which case they really can't answer your research question? And can you apply them to a patient who's in front of you? So the very important side of this is to avoid garbage in, garbage out, of course, in a comprehensive assessment of evidence. Now, this is an example. This is just a list of a few sources of independent drug information. It's not comprehensive, but I wanted to provide it to you because it's a very, you can get a lot of information on drugs for free on the internet at this point. This type of evaluation is much more readily available than in past. And these are all groups that use rigorous systematic review methods in order to evaluate the benefits and harmful effects of drugs. So I think everyone will get the slides will be available publicly after this presentation as well. So you can certainly have a copy of those. And one of the things that I wanted to point out is an initiative that Revue Prescrire, that also has an English version, Prescrire International, has started to do each year, and that's to publish a list of drugs to avoid. So drugs that have a poor benefit-risk balance. And that's also a very simple and straightforward intervention in terms of stimulating more appropriate care. And so I wanted, here you can see that Therapeutics Initiative, the independent group that I work with in Canada, has republished Prescrire's list, and so has the Dutch organization, the Geneesmiddel Bulletin. I wanted also to give you an example of how ads provide a different message about the effectiveness of treatments compared with independent evidence-based information. So this is an ad for fesoterodine, or Toviaz is the brand name, a drug for overactive bladder. Really the most important treatment outcome for overactive bladder is urinary. So overactive bladder, the worst symptom and what people really say that they want to find a solution for is urinary incontinence. So if you're looking at treatment outcomes, the most important outcome is urinary continence. What you have here in the ad is just a very vague claim, and the idea almost magically of 100% effectiveness to get patients to focus on life. This is an example of a systematic review and of how the information was provided for the public. You'll see that, in fact, only 1 out of 10 of the women who use the drug become continent, as compared to women on placebo. But more women than this, so about 2 out of 10 would experience side effects of dry mouth, constipation, or dry eyes. So I wanted to conclude just by saying that commercial influences on clinical practice and research are widespread, that there's a need for institutional and policy change to prevent undue influence, but there's also a role that students and health professionals can take in seeking independent sources of information and avoiding promotional education. whether it is promotional information sources while studying or continuing professional education that's industry sponsored. I'm going to just also say that we'll be sending you, so we have a little exercise planned for you for after this webinar. We'll be sending you information by email about it tomorrow. This is an opportunity just to do your own evaluation on a set of 3 ads. You're welcome to choose one advertisement or another. You don't have to. You don't have to do it's not a homework assignment. You don't have to assess all of them, but really to look at what are the main messages and to compare the messages in the ad with a recent summary evaluation by Prescrire International. So to look at how does a message in the ad compare with independent information on this drug. These are all recent Australian Medical Journal ads. And one thing that I chose, I chose 2 ads for opioids because of also wanting you to look at the messages in terms of the whole epidemic that has occurred, especially in North America, of opioid deaths and abuse, of increased deaths and abuse due to opioid use. There's less of a problem in Australia, but certainly it exists as well, and it exists internationally at this point. And if you look at this website, if you go to this website, Healthy Skepticism, you'll see also what's called a hitchhiker's guide to drug ads. So this is just really a guide to what are the types of things you want to look at. Are they using seductive images? Are they using irrelevant information? How have they presented the evidence? And if they present references, can you actually get them? So I wanted to stop here, and I'll just take a few minutes to answer some questions. Do we, oops. So do we have some questions or no? Wait, okay, we don't have any questions. Okay, there is one question. Sorry, I'm just getting a.
There's a few questions.
Oh yeah, there are a few questions. Okay. Okay, so one question was, in short, they divert attention. With what argument can we make them step up? So I think that one of the sides to keep in mind is just that to really understand that the role of promotion is not a neutral role to provide information on medicines, that it is a role to promote sales. And so, of course, you can challenge information from say, a sponsored speaker. One of the things that's very important is to have a more complete look, and any treatment will have both benefits and harm. But beyond actually I guess, getting someone who's promoting a medicine to step up, I think, another alternative is really to look at other sources. Okay, so another question is, I'm a physician and a PhD student. As such, I have to interact with pharmaceutical companies for multi-center studies. How to stay objective then? So I think if you are a researcher who is carrying out studies for companies, there certainly is a role for these studies to be carried out by academic researchers, to be carried out separately from the company itself. So very differently from that example I gave of the vortioxetine study where Takeda as a company determined everything. I think it's important to have firewalls. So it's important for the design of the study for the company not to be involved in the design of the study, not to be involved in the data monitoring board, not to be involved in choosing investigators. There are a number of ways that actually you can have a study be conducted with a firewall so that the sponsor does not have an involvement, for instance, that is not their statisticians who are doing the analysis. And the other thing that's very important is to have a protocol that's published in advance so that anyone can see what was planned ahead of time. Another question, do I know of other students' initiatives? I know that there's also, and some of the no free lunch groups also have student branches that are very involved in similar initiatives to the one in AMSA. I think the UK Students Association is also involved. There's an Italian Association of Medical Students. What I would suggest is to get in touch with actually ANEMF. The French Medical Students Association has also become very involved in raising concerns about undue commercial influence. What I'd suggest is getting back involved, and we'll get in touch with our student association contacts to try to put you in touch with somebody in your country. And then I think, what else is there? Question. Hi, everyone from Berlin. Will the session also be recorded? Yes, we're recording the session. Okay, one question. I'm a medical student, and my friends often tell me about the need to be in contact with pharmaceutical companies during our studies because they will be partners in our future professional life. When I tell them that we need to be careful in our interactions with them. Very interesting. So what do you have to say about that? I think that you're certainly playing a very important role in terms of saying you don't have to be in touch with them. I think it's especially important as a student to obtain information from independent sources of information. Many doctors believe, so it used to be more of a case that doctors believed that it was inevitable to see, for instance, to see sales representatives as a source of information on medicines. Many doctors choose not to see sales representatives. And there is also research evidence that those doctors are prescribing in a less costly manner and on average have more generic prescribing than doctors who see sales representatives more often. The other thing that we've seen is out of the experience in the US where many medical faculties have started now restricting the contact between medical students and pharmaceutical companies, that the graduates of those universities are actually prescribing more, have actually higher quality prescribing, more judicious prescribing than students, than those who studied in universities with less restrictive policies. So really it would say that, yes, I guess what you could say is everyone has a choice. That certainly as doctors, those students can choose to interact with pharmaceutical companies and to see sales representatives, or they can choose not to. And there are many, many sources of information at this point in 2018 with that allow a person to obtain very good information on both established and newer medicines without seeing sales representatives. So I guess I'll stop there. Thank you very much. Thank you for the great questions as well. And I'll say goodbye. Sorry, you. Oh, okay. Okay. Okay, so there were a few more I didn't see. Sorry, I said goodbye too soon. We have one of the students who is from ANAMF, so that's the French Medical Students Association, who has provided her contact information that I guess we'll make available via, so Ancella can send out from HI to the other, to the participants from France. And also a comment from Peter from UAEM, so that's Universities for Allied for Essential Medicines in Berlin, saying they also are doing a very similar ranking in Germany of conflict of interest policies, and what they found that there are very few explicit medical school law policies in place, but that they've seen some partial movements towards having conflict of interest policies. And so again, they're another organization that German medical students can contact and join. Great. Okay, so I'll say thank you very much. And I'll now say goodbye. It says I'm just getting technical support about saying goodbye or not. I haven't. Oh, okay. There's a few more down here. Again, sorry, I have an interface where I don't see all the messages. So also the UAEM, so Universities Allied for Essential Medicines, also has a branch in the Netherlands, and feel free to contact them. So also, that's an organization of medical students that is very involved in improving access to essential medicines, in improving the policies when it comes to research to develop new medicines that is carried out by universities, and also is becoming involved in advocacy as well in terms of limiting commercial influences in it. Okay. And in Switzerland, so there's also Pharmaceutical in Spain, so many different organizations that is very exciting in terms of groups that you can get in touch with who are doing similar work now, who are both involved. So in Spain as well, a scorecard has been launched, and also a group of Belgian GPs have started a similar study. And there was a study very similar to the scorecard carried out in France that had an enormous influence in terms of leading the deans of all of the medical faculties in France to get together and to develop jointly a charter on conflicts of interest. So I think what this shows is medical students, also less I think has been done in pharmacy education, but also possibility for similar initiatives in pharmacy education, that students can have an enormous amount of power in terms of leading to change, to positive changes in this domain.
So we'll be closing now.
Yeah.
On behalf of HI, thanks Barbara for this fantastic lecture, and thank you all. If you have more questions for Barbara, or you want to know more also about the work that HI is doing on pharmaceutical promotion and on access to medicines, don't hesitate to contact us. And thank you, and see you again.
Yes, thanks very much. And bye-bye.
Bye.